It's September, in the year 52 BC in Gaul, modern-day France. The fate of Rome's most famous general hangs in the balance. Julius Caesar's legions are surrounded as they lay siege to a rebellion stronghold called Alesia. Caesar has gambled everything on subduing the tribes of Gaul. And if he fails, a terrible fate awaits him in Rome. But for the Gauls, the stakes couldn't be higher. The genocide of their people.
Alesia really was the last stand of the Gauls. If they destroy Caesar's army, he would never return, so it was a moment of great importance for the Gauls.
Caesar faces a strong enemy. An alliance of tribes brought together in rebellion by a charismatic and battle-hardened leader, Vercingetorix.
Vercingetorix focused armies inside Alesia and outside Alesia, numbering perhaps 250 to 300,000 people, against Caesar's army, a fifth that size.
Caesar must have feared that this uniting of Gallic tribes under Vercingetorix could be just the beginning of a more unified, strategic, and organized foe.
Vercingetorix was the one leader in Gaul who had all the qualities needed to destroy Caesar.
But the true story of the key moments that led to this point is shrouded in mystery. Why did Caesar take such a risky gamble and conduct a campaign of terror through Gaul? Today, there's one source above all that historians rely on to decipher the events in Gaul: Caesar's own words.
It was very important for Caesar politically to stay in touch with Rome. And one way he was able to do this was to write up every year an account of the campaigns he had just fought.
Julius Caesar therefore began writing what we now call his commentaries, delivering to the Roman people a thorough account, but also a self-interested account of what it is he had achieved on behalf of the people of Rome.
But now historians need to decipher fact from fiction as they investigate this lost world.
Since Caesar's Gallic War commentaries were chronicling his own life and events for which he was the driver, we certainly have cause to wonder how truthful he is being.
We always have to ask ourselves, given how much of a stake Caesar had in writing about the Gauls, why he includes certain information and not others.
Scholars tend to view what Caesar says as not so much complete lies or utterly unreliable, but just a presentation that's very slanted. And you have to read against the grain of the Gallic War to try to understand fully the conflict.
The first mystery is, who are the Gaul people that Caesar faces?
The Gauls left no written account of their side of the war. We've always been dependent in many ways on Caesar's account.
Today in France, Vercingetorix is remembered as a hero, a freedom fighter who united the major tribes of Gaul in rebellion against the Romans. But archaeologists are only now understanding the true history of Vercingetorix and the Gauls.
There's been a lot of archaeological work in the area of Caesar's Gallic War, trying to match up what he wrote in his commentaries with what can be discovered on the ground.
This is indeed just a tremendously exciting time to be studying Gaul. Our ability to study the remains of these societies, the food deposits, the bone deposits, and the wooden structures are just dramatically greater than at any point in the past.
So who were the Gauls? By the time Caesar arrived in Gaul, the tribes controlled an area spanning most of modern-day France and surrounding areas. But their dominance had once spread much further. Around 400 BC, tribes controlled land spreading almost as far as the Black Sea in the east.
The peoples that Julius Caesar encountered in Gaul, whom he calls the Gauls, are largely what we might now call Celtic peoples, united in the material forms of their culture and seemingly largely united in the languages that they spoke.
The fact that we are referring to the Gauls as Gauls is in one way or another related to Caesar's Gallic War. He himself says explicitly, there are three groupings of sorts, and the most important one are the people who refer to themselves as Celti, as Celts, but we, the Romans, we call them Galli, we call them Gauls.
The area that the Romans called Gaul is marked out by natural borders: the English Channel, the Atlantic Ocean, the Pyrenees and Alps mountain ranges, and the River Rhine. But beyond these borders, there are other tribes. In the south of present-day Britain, but also north of the River Rhine, in Belgium and Switzerland, and finally in the north of Italy. Dozens of independent Gaul tribes exist, united by religion and culture. Amongst the most influential are the Bituri, the Arverni, the Aedui, and the Senones in central France. In the 4th century BC, the most powerful tribes of Gaul are located at the heart of the tin and gold trade routes, two metals sought after by the Greek colony of Massalia, the future French city of Marseille. The development of trade with the Greeks led to the construction of roads and the setting up of lucrative tolls by the Gauls, notably by the Senone tribe, who were on a major crossroads of this trade route. Led by their chief Brennus, they used the toll money to finance political alliances and expeditions in search of new land and wealth. Brennus and his tribe would establish an infamous reputation amongst the Romans.
Why were the Gauls conceived of already as such enemies of Rome? One reason was that Brennus and the Senones had sacked the city of Rome in around 390 BC.
Brennus leads 60,000 Senone warriors and their allies to Tuscany, attracted by the rich lands in the Clusium region. Then he heads for Rome itself and partly razes it to the ground. After long weeks of occupation, Brennus and his Gauls only agree to withdraw in exchange for a heavy ransom. But when the time comes to put the gold on the scales, the leader of the Senones has a surprise.
On va plutôt prendre les nôtres.
The Gauls' weights are much heavier than the Romans, forcing their victims to pour even more gold onto the scales. And Brennus even adds his own sword.
Brennus and the Senones were the only foreign invaders to occupy the city of Rome in 800 years.
Vae victis.
The event produced such trauma in Roman politics in an ongoing way that many hundreds of years later, when the Romans founded Roman colonies, they continued to make it a requirement specified in the charter of those colonies that in the case of a Gallic attack, the citizens of the colonies were to mobilize in defense of the city of Rome.
But the Romans would have their revenge. Over the following centuries, the Romans clashed with the Gallic tribes on several occasions. First, in the north of Italy, where they triumphed in the 3rd century BC. Then on the other side of the Alps, in the southeast of modern-day France. By the end of the 2nd century BC, after a bitter struggle, the Romans had imposed themselves on the south of Gaul to create an area they knew as Provincia.
By the age of Julius Caesar, it's no longer realistic to believe that the Romans were afraid in an existential level of what might happen in any war with the Gauls.
So what priceless treasures did Gaul possess? By the time of Julius Caesar, Much of northern Gaul remained free of Roman rule. The Gauls were long thought of as unsophisticated barbarians. But could this be a myth?
The Romans knew that Gaul was populous, and they knew that it was rich. If it hadn't been those things, it wouldn't have been worth going there.
So where did their wealth come from? Archaeologists think that the answer lies in investigating the Gauls' agriculture. Sami Ben Makad uses experimental archaeology to investigate their tools and techniques. Today, he's testing ancient farming technology, known in Latin as a vallus. It's the ancestor of the modern combine harvester.
So here we are in a field of spelt grain. It interests us because it has a rather interesting biological property. It breaks easily. And when it gets caught in the comb, it tears off, then it unhooks and drops easily into the box here.
Sami's investigations reveal that the Gauls were inventing new technology to increase their farming productivity.
This machine is known in the northeastern quarter of Gaul, so around Belgium, Germany, and that's where most spelt is grown. The other regions grow less. So perhaps the machine is associated with this particular grain.
The discovery shatters the myth of an unsophisticated society. In fact, Gaul farming innovations would later be adopted by the Romans. Could Iron Age farming be the key to the Gauls' wealth and the target of Roman invasion? Now investigators want to hunt down lost structures to discover the scale of this wealth. And they think that clues can be found by taking to the skies. Pierre Nouvel is hunting for the telltale traces of long-lost ancient farms. He's a specialist in aerial archaeology. At certain times of the year, Pierre knows that clues can appear.
Can you go to the grey shed over there at 10 o'clock? I can see an anomaly, so it's worth getting closer.
From the sky, mysterious shapes suddenly become visible. It's the trace of a structure more than 2,000 years old. Pierre thinks he's found the outline of an ancient Gaul farm. Now archaeologists can reconstruct what they looked like. The Gauls built a house, a granary on stilts, and an enclosure for their animals. Then they protected their farm buildings with a deep perimeter ditch. But the wooden structures are long gone. Today, the protective ditch is filled with sediment, but it's clearly visible from the air.
Imagine a ditch dug in the chalk. The chalk isn't very fertile, not much water, so all it takes is a little bit of drought and the wheat won't grow much. But next to it, above the ditch, the wheat will have much more food, will have a lot of water, so it'll stay green longer and will grow higher, and that's what we see.
Aerial investigations have further revolutionized archaeologists' understanding of the Gauls, not just showing the sophistication of their farms, but also the scale on which they transformed the landscape. In some areas of the French countryside, archaeologists have unearthed lost structures every 500 yards. The Gauls' development of intensive agriculture allowed them to feed a population of several million and amass wealth that would attract hostile powers. Soon, outside threats would force many of the Gauls into cities. At the turn of the 1st century BC, a succession of crises led the Gauls to regroup in fortified settlements that the Romans called oppidum. One tribe that built these fortified towns is called the Arverni. They control a large territory in southeast France and build a capital called Gergovia and a second town called Corinth. The Arverni are a powerful and prosperous people. And it was probably in Corinth that the most famous Arverni is born. Vercingetorix, the future freedom fighter who will take on Julius Caesar. Archaeological investigations show that Gauls invented nail clippers and shined their hair with a solid soap they also invented. Until the age of 12 or 13, Vercingetorix's mother takes care of his education. Then his father, Celtulos, takes charge of his political and military training. He's a renowned warlord, and as is tradition, keeps the heads of his slain enemies as trophies. Celtulos is one of the highest dignitaries of the Arverni. In Corinth today, archaeologists have unearthed a space that might have been dedicated to political assemblies. The residents of Corinth, like many Gauls, practiced something akin to democracy. They form assemblies to vote on laws and appoint magistrates. Vercingetorix must have been influenced by his father, Celtulos.
He would have been born into a family in which ambition was prized.
Vercingetorix's father tried to become the king of his own people, the Arverni.
But his attempt to buy the loyalty of his people will backfire. On the other side of the Alps from Gaul, Julius Caesar is awarded a new and lucrative job, the proconsul of Gaul, the equivalent of a governor.
The proconsul is a politician from Rome who is then sent off to govern a province of the Roman Empire.
It's not in Caesar's character to waste this opportunity.
Caesar's ambition was extraordinary. We're told that once he was traveling through a small alpine village on his way to Spain, and the friends who were with him said, could you imagine doing politics in this village? And Caesar looked at them very seriously and said, I would much rather be first in this village than second in Rome.
The title of proconsul puts him in charge of several Roman provinces in Gaul. He now rules Dalmatia in the east, Cisalpine Gaul in the north of Italy, and Provincia stretching as far north as Switzerland.
But Caesar took Gaul to mean everything north of that as well. For Caesar, Gaul encompassed all of modern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, and it became Caesar's goal to make all of that a Roman province.
He would have anticipated that his years as proconsul of Gaul would bring with them enormous opportunities for wealth and for military victories that could help him burnish his reputation as a politician.
As proconsul, Caesar could amass wealth from people he conquered, and that was good motivation.
Julius Caesar was widely rumored to have gone deeply into debt in his pursuit of political office immediately prior to his departure for Gaul.
The rules of war were very different in ancient Rome. It was about glory and power and wealth for the general.
But in Rome, Caesar's ambition worries some senators. Even his powerful allies, Crassus and Pompey, with whom he had conspired to dominate Roman politics. Historians now call this trio the first triumvirate.
Ave consules. Ave Caesar.
The alliance of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, really they were forming a gang of three, a small group that would try to dominate the entire Roman political scene, to control the entire republic.
If Caesar wants to seize full control of Rome for himself, it's these two men he'll need to outwit.
he needed military victories under his belt that could rival those of Pompey the Great. And he also needed to secure funds so that he could pay back some of his debts.
Caesar sees Gaul as a chance to forge his own destiny.
Someone like Caesar, once he arrived in his province, was virtually uncontrollable until the moment in time when his command officially ended.
Caesar saw the proconsulship of Gaul as a stepping stone towards greater power.
Caesar's aim is to conquer new areas so he can return to Rome a hero and wealthy. Now he needs to find a suitable target. The Gauls were long dismissed by historians as poor and uncivilized compared to their Roman neighbors. But now, new archaeological research is exposing the truth about Gaul tribes, like the Arverni. And the scale of their city at Corinth is a good illustration of this. Archaeologists have reconstructed what the fortified oppidum might have looked like. At the town's center, the Arverni build a large religious sanctuary, a wooden structure used for meetings, and a large marketplace. Nearby, they build residential houses and craftsmen's workshops. Archaeologists at Corinth today have found a surprising link between the Gauls and Rome. Thousands of pottery jars from Italy, evidence of Rome's growing influence. In the first half of the 1st century BC, the Roman Republic was an immense economic powerhouse, controlling much of the Mediterranean. But its influence spread much further. Roman traders exported products to the 4 corners of Europe: metal, crockery, jewelry, horses, and its famous wine. Evidence of Roman amphora imported from present-day Tuscany revealed that the Arverni tribe already had links to the Romans that would soon become their sworn enemies.
They were not an undeveloped civilization. Indeed, the Gauls at this stage were gathering together in towns. They were trading with the Romans. They were not the shaggy Gauls of Roman stereotype.
In Corinth, Vercingetorix must have joined his father at celebrations, allowing him to meet influential people from tribes all over Gaul. But Vercingetorix's life is about to change. The ambitions of his father, Celtulos, to reign as king over the Arverni is considered a betrayal by the tribe. The Arverni elect their leaders and refuse the idea of royalty. It's an unforgivable crime for which Celtulos is arrested and sentenced to death. The execution must have been an immense trauma for the young Vercingetorix. But soon, he'll be given the chance to restore his honor. Julius Caesar is preparing to invade. In Rome, Caesar is looking for an excuse to attack Gaul. Now historians believe he found it in a powerful ally outside the provinces he controls, a Gaul tribe called the Aedui, whose capital is Bibracte. The Aedui control territory strategic to Roman trade routes on the Saône and Loire rivers. And they have strong influence over many nearby tribes. But what did it mean to be allied with Rome? Today, the ruins of Bibracte are being excavated by archaeologists, who have discovered that it was once home to between 5,000 and 20,000 people.
The Aedui had a special relationship with Rome. According to Caesar himself, they were not just allies, but they were kinsmen. They were brothers of the Roman people. This means probably that they thought they shared common ancestors. They all were descended from the Trojans.
When a population allied with Rome, it was usually obligatory for Rome's ally to supply Rome with assistance in its ongoing military campaigns. This could include the contribution of troops, the contribution of draft animals, the contribution of timber to build boats, the contribution of food.
Now archaeologists think it's the Aedui who will give Caesar his excuse for expansion. In 60 BC, an important member of the Aedui, a man called Decoding, travels to Rome. It's likely that he met Caesar to discuss a situation in Gaul. There's a rumor circulating about a rival tribe called the Helvetii. The Helvetii are preparing to migrate en masse across Gaul from their territory in modern-day Switzerland.
Caesar tells us that they were a very warlike people, and that because of the threat of Germans from the north, they felt squeezed in their current location and were making plans to move west into modern-day France.
Decoding is worried that the Helvetii will threaten his Aedui tribe as they pass, and Caesar claims they're a threat to the balance of power in his provinces. But one thing historians have long puzzled over is how much the Helvetii really worried the Roman general. Clues lie on the shores of Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland. In 1857, archaeologists unearth a series of 2,000-year-old treasures from beneath the lake's water. The site is called La Tène and dates to just before the Helvetii lived here. Today, archaeologist Marc-Antoine Kaiser is investigating how the artifacts survived the centuries.
So the secret of the exceptional, extraordinary preservation of the objects from La Tène is underwater. So what we find is that the objects are protected from oxygen, so nothing degrades them. So they are preserved for thousands of years. And on top of that, this sediment is soft. There is no settling of the layers. There is no physical pressure on these objects. So that's what makes this absolutely amazing conservation possible.
Today, some 5,000 treasures have been recovered. They're protected and studied at the nearby Latenium Museum. Archaeologists cast many of the relics in plaster to preserve them before they deteriorated in the open air. Objects like this cartwheel.
This is the wheel as it looked when it was discovered. So you can see what the diggers at the beginning of the 20th century took out of the wet sediment. And then behind me, here is the original object showing how it's deteriorated over the decades.
The relics expose the warfaring nature of these people. And now they are revolutionizing our understanding of the Gauls. The remarkably preserved treasures allow archaeologists to define the characteristic style and form of Gaul artifacts. When they compare the relics from La Tène to discoveries unearthed across France, they expose the close links between tribes all over Gaul.
What enabled them to identify the Gauls in Alesia and everywhere else in France is the comparison with these finds from La Tène.
Archaeologists examining these treasures have uncovered the sophistication of the Gauls and exposed the danger that a tribe like the Helvetii could pose. In 58 BC, Caesar decides to come to the aid of Roman allies, the Aedui, and stand up to the migrating Helvetii.
The Helvetii and their migration was a tremendous opportunity for Caesar. It was the excuse that he had been looking for to attack the Gauls.
The Helvetii came to Caesar asking for permission to move through the Roman province.
Caesar felt that this rearrangement of something like geopolitics in an area of Roman interest was unacceptable.
Caesar needs a pretext to attack and comes up with a plan. The Helvetii tribe want to move to an area in the west of Gaul called Santone. But the route takes them through a Roman province. Caesar denies them passage. It's a clever move for two reasons. It buys him time to mobilize his troops and get his legions into position. But it will also give Caesar his excuse to attack. He knows the Helvetii will be forced to travel through the land of tribes allied with the Aedui, the friends of the Romans. When the Helvetii march into this territory, Caesar is waiting, and all but wipes them out.
Caesar claimed to have found records of the Helvetii indicating that 368,000 men, women, and children attempted the migration, and when he sent them back, there were only 110,000 survivors.
They absolutely disappear from the pages of history after losing to Caesar.
And that victory, I think, gave him a taste for more.
To exercise Roman political control over the autonomy of tribes that were beyond the borders of the Roman province came as a surprise to the Gauls and intimated further interference to come.
Julius Caesar's war in Gaul has begun. The Roman general has saved his Aedui tribe allies from hostile forces and destroyed a Gaul tribe in the process. Now he demands tribute, horses, food, and men to form auxiliary fighting units for the Romans. The Aedui and their allies have no choice but to accept. And to seal the deal, they hand over hostages to the Romans.
It was long-standing Roman practice that when a people surrendered to Rome, they were expected to turn over hostages. Hostages would be pledges of loyalty to Rome, and these were often the leaders of their societies. And by keeping these hostages around him, Caesar would be able to prevent rebellion back in their homelands.
Some historians believe that Vercingetorix, the future freedom fighter from the Arverni tribe, was one of these hostages.
We're not told directly that Vercingetorix was a hostage, but we are told that Vercingetorix had some kind of a relationship with Caesar.
Vercingetorix was a very young man when he first met Caesar. When he's taken to the Roman encampment, it must have been an eye-opening experience. Roman camps were always built in the same layout. They were gigantic mobile cities populated by tens of thousands of people. On one side, tents lined up in neat rows for legionnaires, cavalry, and infantry. On the other, the more luxurious tents of Caesar and the legion's leaders. It was a symbol of what the Roman army was capable of. Vercingetorix must have been witness to the intense military, but also political activity of Caesar. Some historians think that he even fought for the Romans. Caesar always placed the Gaul troops in the front line. And Vercingetorix is thought to have impressed on the battlefield. Military skill was a surefire way for the Gaul to distinguish himself in the eyes of Caesar. Caesar can't have had any doubt about the Gauls being a sophisticated and worthy adversary. Over the next 3 years, Caesar sets out to bring all of Gaul under his rule by alliances and treaties, or by force. After the campaign against the Helvetii, Caesar fights the Germans in 58 BC. Then he conquers Belgian tribes the following year, before turning down the Atlantic coast to end up at the foot of the Pyrenees. The Gauls now have no doubt about Caesar's aim. No one knows if Vercingetorix took part in these battles. But after 2 or 3 years, Caesar allows him to return home, hoping that Vercingetorix would become an influential ally. The young Arverni tribe member has other ideas. He wants to control his capital, Gergovia, and decides to raise support where the pressure of Roman rule is felt strongest.
Caesar's war in Gaul was hugely devastating for peoples there. They had their farms destroyed. They lost countless numbers of lives. They lost the treasures in their religious sanctuaries.
Vercingetorix hones his talents as a speaker and takes a position against Caesar and the Arverni nobility who have formed alliances with Rome.
He thought the leadership of his people were too cozy with the Romans. He thought they were too cowardly.
Historians even know the content of his speeches, passed down in Caesar's own writing. We must fight for a common freedom. Buoyed by his new popularity, Vercingetorix returns to Gergovia and succeeds in becoming king. Now he has a new aim, to become ruler of all the tribes of Gaul. He mints coins with his image to establish his reputation. From the Arverni capital of Gergovia, Vercingetorix is aware of everything that happens in Gaul. The elite of Gaul remained faithful to their alliances with Caesar, but the people are becoming more radical. Caesar is about to get his first taste of what he's up against. But how will he respond? In 54 BC, a Gaul chief called Ambiorix decides he needs to fight back against Julius Caesar's Romans. He leads a tribe called the Eburones, based in modern-day Belgium, and he attacks and annihilates one of Caesar's legions while the general is away.
For reasons that are somewhat murky, the Ambiorix turned on the Romans. It may well have something to do with the persistent staging of Romans in winter camps in the area and the demands that those winter camps made.
It's terrible news for Caesar.
It was a disaster for him in Gaul because it would inspire others now to consider rising up against him. And of course, it also was a blow to his prestige back in Rome. This was his first great loss.
It was perhaps the most significant military disaster of the Gallic campaign so far.
Although he may have claimed to have pacified Gaul, he had not won the allegiance of all of the Gallic people.
And he was determined to capture Ambiorix, the mastermind of this terrible loss.
But time after time, Ambiorix manages to escape.
What he did in the meantime was he devastated the countryside of the Eburones. He destroyed their homeland. Any building his soldiers saw, any farm was burnt to the ground. Many were put into captivity, many were killed.
Caesar's brutality is total. He executes tens of thousands of Eburones, wiping them from the history books.
Again and again in Caesar's texts, we read of occasions when his enemies approach him, asking for his mercy, and he grants it. On the other hand, the example of the revolt of the Eburones and its aftermath shows us precisely the opposite.
There are several moments within Caesar's narrative where he basically says that he had eradicated, wiped out a particular Gallic tribe.
It is fair to call that genocide.
We are looking at something we would easily classify as truly evil.
But Caesar knows that even this brutal action wouldn't lose him support in Rome.
If the enemy slaughtered Roman soldiers, if they ambushed them, as Ambiorix did, then the reprisals would be fierce. What Caesar did against the Eburones would have been considered perfectly legitimate.
This is just one of the many acts of cruelty that Caesar orders against the Gauls. In 54 BC, the Roman general orders an assembly of Gaul chiefs to judge one of their own. He accuses Acco, the chief of the allied Senone tribe, of stirring rebellion. It's a deliberate show of force by Caesar.
One thing you see over the course of his time in Gaul was that he did deal more and more aggressively with opposition, and he presumably thought this was a way to suppress rebellion, but it actually made matters worse for him.
Caesar is upping the ante in Gaul.
Acco was found guilty and was punished in the traditional Roman manner. He was stripped, beaten to death, and then beheaded afterwards. This shocked Gallic society. It was one of the talking points that leadership used to launch the Great Uprising against the Romans the following year.
Very quickly, secret negotiations take place in the four corners of Gaul. From his Arverni homeland, Vercingetorix sends spies to keep track of the growing unrest. He knows that the fate of Gaul itself is now at stake. In just 5 years, Julius Caesar has led his Roman forces to victory after victory, wiping out entire Gaul tribes in the process, and forcing others to submit to Rome as allies. But soon Vercingetorix will turn the tide of war and assemble the largest alliance of Gaul fighters in history to force Caesar to the very brink of defeat.